He fired his secretary in front of the entire company over a mistake that seemed foolish, only to have her return 3 days later, not to ask for forgiveness, but to hold the power to decide the fate of his company. She didn't seek revenge. She stayed silent, but that silence was the deadliest move. Because sometimes the one you look down on holds the final ace. On Monday, the sky above Manhattan was cloudless, so clear it seemed nothing in the world could be hidden. On the 54th floor of a sleek black glass skyscraper, Hawthorne Co. entered a fateful meeting. The main conference room felt suspended in mid-air. Glass walls opened to a sprawling cityscape, but in the hearts of those present there was something far more terrifying than the height, the gaze of Nathan Hawthorne, the CEO infamous for his absolute coldness. Seated at the head of the table, Nathan was the center of a universe where everything bent to his will. A single glance could make the CFO lower his head. A slight nod could shut down a multi-million-dollar project. At the far end of the room, Emily Carter, a young secretary, stood quietly by the presentation controls. Her shoulders were stiff, but her eyes remained fixed on the laptop. This was the biggest meeting of the month, one where an investment group was considering pouring hundreds of millions of USD into Hawthorne Co. Every slide in the presentation had been meticulously prepared over days. She had checked every file 3 times, made 2 backups. There could be no mistakes. But then, when it came to the critical part, the financial strategy document, the screen suddenly went black. A message appeared in the air. Unsupported format. Please check file source. The silence was suffocating. The only sound was someone gripping their pen so tightly the cap popped off. Eyes began darting toward Emily, quick, sharp, and full of judgment. The investment representative, a silver-haled man with a probing gaze, turned to look at no one spoke. But Nathan didn't need words. He stood up, slowly. His suit was wrinkle-free. Each step he took toward the end of the room felt like he was walking toward an execution, and the one facing judgment was the trembling girl standing there, hands shaking from cold or fear she couldn't tell. "Which file did you send?" Nathan's voice wasn't loud, but it was hard and sharp, like metal scraping stone. Emily fumbled with the laptop. She found it wasn't the final version. It was a draft, missing pages. But last night she had sent the right one. She was certain. "I sent the final version. Maybe the system, a sync error." Nathan laughed. Not a joyful laugh, the kind that made people want to vanish from the room. "A sync error," he repeated, as if echoing a bad joke. "Do you think this is a college internship program?" He turned fully toward the board, his eyes icy. "This is what happens when you hire based on diversity metrics. A girl with no standout degree, no experience, no voice, but perfect for the image campaign." A chair to the right scraped. Someone stood, gathered their papers, and left without a word. Emily didn't bow her head. She didn't explain. She didn't cry. She just looked at him. A quiet but not powerless gaze. It wasn't the look of someone wounded, but of someone who had just memorized every detail, every word, every glare, every cut, straight to her heart. Nathan raised an eyebrow, as if waiting for her to fight back, but she stayed silent, and that, more than anything, unsettled him the most. "You're fired," he said, as if slashing a red X across her existence. Emily lowered her head, not in surrender, but to gather the pride blazing in her chest. She closed the laptop, walked straight to the door. The room held its breath with every step she took. When the door shut behind her, only one young employee whispered, "She didn't deserve that." But no one responded. No one wanted to be next. In the elevator, Emily looked at herself in the mirror. Her face wasn't pale, her eyes still clear, but something in her had shifted. On the outside, she was still the girl in a simple office outfit, but inside something had just awakened. She whispered almost inaudibly, "I'll come back, but not as a secretary." The doors opened. Emily stepped out, and in the conference room on the 54th floor, where they had just witnessed a public humiliation, no one knew they had just lost something irreplaceable. The March wind on Fifth Avenue cut through the skin. Emily Carter walked along the towering glass buildings where she had once been a silent shadow trailing behind powerful footsteps. Today she was no longer part of Hawthorne Co, and that had never made her feel lighter. She didn't head home right away. Instead, she stepped into a small cafe on the corner of Madison Street, a place she used to escape to during tense meeting breaks. Her hands still trembled, but her eyes didn't. She sat at her familiar table and ordered a cup of peppermint tea, the drink that had once helped her survive days when she felt swallowed by silence and disdain. Her laptop opened. No more emails from managers, no more meeting schedules, just one thing. The backup she had sent that night, the correct, complete version. It was still there, intact. She wasn't crazy. She hadn't been wrong, and for the first time in months, she let herself sit with her anger. Not a loud, destructive rage, but a deep one, quiet, like the sea awaiting the tide. 3 days later, Nathan Hawthorne sat in his private office, the afternoon light reflecting off the glossy glass desk. He had never paid attention to the emptiness left after a firing, but this time, something felt off. Emily Carter hadn't come back, hadn't reacted, hadn't sued, hadn't posted a single status. Her silence crept like a shadow through every floor of the building. Employees passing by the old secretary's room began to whisper. It seemed they were starting to miss someone they had never truly noticed before. Nathan tried to brush off the feeling, but an email from the IT department made his hand freeze on the keyboard. No user error detected. File corruption due to server sync malfunction, unrelated to individual Carter. He read it 3 times. Each word scratched lightly at the pride of a man who had always believed he was never wrong. He didn't reply. He just deleted the email, then sat still. A heavy silence settled over him, a sensation he'd never felt in his life. Not after hundreds of negotiations or thousands of hours standing before shareholders. Emily Carter, the girl with the wordless gaze, had left him with a question mark so large it haunted him. In another city, Emily sat in the quiet library of an old mansion. Across from her was a calm, silver-haired man sipping red wine. "I knew you wouldn't call unless you had a good reason," he said without looking up. Emily nodded. She placed a stack of documents on the table as quietly as she had lived for years. On the cover, a familiar gold-embossed logo gleamed. Hawthorne Co. "I need you to invest." The man, Richard Carter, a legendary investor who had saved 4 conglomerates from bankruptcy, chuckled softly. "You don't need money, Emily. You need a chance to show them who you really are." She looked at him, a gaze both grateful and resolute. "I don't need them to kneel. I just want them to remember that some names can't be thrown around carelessly, and some people can't be defined by the positions they once held." Richard raised his glass, took a sip, and set it down. "You don't need revenge, but you need them to understand. Silence isn't surrender." Emily said nothing more. She had once walked through hallways where people pretended not to see her, nodded at empty lectures, been called secretary as if that summed up her entire worth. But this time, when she returned, she wouldn't carry the past, she would carry the truth. And a name that, this time, they'd have to look up to say. Thursday afternoon on the 54th floor of Hawthorne Co. was steeped in a nameless silence, the stillness of the sky before a storm. Nathan Hawthorne sat upright in the main conference room, his eyes fixed on the door. Today was a critical signing with Carter Capital, a deal significant enough to revive the company after a string of declining quarters. Every gaze was pinned on this meeting. No one knew much about the representative from the investment group, only that they were someone to be treated with absolute caution. The sound of heels echoed down the hallway, sharp as a blade slicing through the rigid air. The door opened. Richard Carter stepped in first, silver-haired, with a calm demeanor and piercing eyes that seemed to have read the souls of everyone he'd ever faced. The room stood up, but it was the person following him who froze every gaze. Emily. In a charcoal blazer, her hair tied up high, her eyes cold and steady as a pillar, she walked in without needing an introduction. She moved as if she had never left this place, as if the spot she'd been pushed out of was the very one she'd chosen to return to. Nathan stood still, not out of shock, but because he hadn't prepared for this. His face didn't change, but his gaze was a fractured painting torn in two. The other executives whispered, "Is that her?" Richard nodded slightly to the room, then sat down. "Allow me to introduce," he said, his voice deliberate. "This is the strategic partner in this deal, and the one with primary control over the disbursement, Emily Carter, my daughter." No one spoke. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was a pen dropping to the floor, a small, terrifying noise. Emily didn't look around. She looked only at Nathan, the man who had once stood above her, now sitting before her. Her eyes didn't reminisce, didn't rage, didn't need vengeance. They simply said, "I know who you are. You never knew me." Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came. "You never asked for my full name," she said, her voice just loud enough, "and because you didn't ask, you never knew what you lost." No one contradicted her. No one dared. Throughout the presentation, Richard did most of the talking. Emily stayed silent, taking notes, nodding lightly. But that silence Nathan felt more keenly than any thunderclap in his life. When the meeting ended, people filed out one by one. Nathan remained seated. Emily was the last to leave, but before the door closed behind her, she paused, right by his chair. "You once thought I was just a secretary," she said softly. "You weren't wrong, but you forgot one thing." Nathan looked up. "Even secretaries have pasts, have names, and have people willing to listen to them." She walked away. The door closed. This time there was no loud bang, just a gentle click, like the period at the end of an era of delusion. That night, Nathan didn't go home. He stayed in his office, staring at his reflection in the glass. Outside was a city that never slept, but inside him was a new stillness, not from being threatened, but because, for the first time, he was no longer in control. Emily Carter, the girl he had once humiliated without mercy, had returned with a name he'd never bothered to ask for, and a position he'd never imagined. But what unsettled him most wasn't the power she held, but the way she looked at him. Not with resentment, not with pity, just the look of someone who no longer let him define her. Rumors don't need confirmation to spread fast. They only need a spark. And in this case, that spark was an anonymous blog post, less than 800 words, yet heavy enough to shatter the image of a man built over 2 decades. Did the CEO of Hawthorne Co. exploit a personal relationship with his female assistant to manipulate a major investment deal? Who really controls Carter Capital? Within less than 6 hours, every media outlet was running headlines. Nathan Hawthorne's name appeared everywhere, plastered like a label. This time, it wasn't financial genius or the man who never yields, but the one who used emotions as a lever for power. And in every article, Emily Carter's name slipped in quietly, becoming the center of suspicion without needing to defend herself, victim or mastermind. The strangest thing was, she didn't speak. No confirmation, no denial, no appearance on any media platform. That silence threw the whole world off balance. At Hawthorne Co.'s headquarters, the air was so thick it was hard to breathe. Shareholders began pulling out. Stock prices dropped by the hour. Employees avoided each other's eyes in the hallways. In the glass office on the 54th floor, Nathan sat alone. The pristine suit that once served as his armor now felt like an unnecessary layer. He had won hundreds of strategic battles before, but now no one listened to him anymore. An emergency meeting was called. Under the cold lights and the stern gazes of the board, one member spoke up. "We're not here to ask if you're guilty. We're here to remind you that when a CEO's reputation gets tangled in a scandal, it's not just personal credibility that's lost. It's this entire company." Nathan sat in silence. He had once thought that if he ever fell, it would be because of a ruthless rival, a failed deal, or a major misstep. He never imagined the fall would come from a girl whose full name he hadn't bothered to learn. The next day he called Emily. The line didn't connect. He sent an email. No reply. He even drove to Carter Capital's office, a white marble building standing silent like a wordless fortress. She wasn't avoiding him. She just no longer needed to respond, and that stripped Nathan of being a CEO, leaving him a solitary man sitting amid the ashes he'd ignited himself. That evening, he stayed in the office. He watched the lights in the high-rise windows go out one by one, like the people who once trusted him, now leaving in silence. All that remained was the faint glow from his phone screen, where no messages came and no one awaited a reply. He remembered her first interview, a small figure, a soft voice, eyes that knew how to listen. He hadn't seen her worth because she didn't roar to demand attention. Now, she didn't need to speak, because the whole world was listening to the silence she left behind. A few blocks away in the quiet study of Carter Capital, Emily sat by the window, watching the city lights reflect in her untouched cup of tea. The press mentioned her name. Social media took sides. Some called her the Diamond Girl, the one who returned to topple the man who'd insulted her. Others said she was exacting a sophisticated revenge. But Emily didn't see herself in any of those labels. She only remembered the moment she stood in the room where he'd fired her, and the look she'd left on that ice-cold conference table. It wasn't the look of a victor. It was the look of someone who, no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She could speak up, she could clarify, but she chose to do nothing, not out of cruelty, but because, sometimes, letting people face their own truth is the only way to make them truly change. That afternoon, the New York sky was draped in a heavy gray. On the top floor of Hawthorne Co's headquarters, the central meeting room was set up for an unprecedented press conference in the company's history. No colored lights, no theme music, no host. Just a podium, a microphone, and hundreds of gazes from the press, shareholders, employees, and those who had once placed their faith in the name Nathan Hawthorne. The broadcast aired live on 4 platforms. The internal network allowed over 700 employees to watch. On social media, thousands had turned on awaiting stream notifications. The door opened. Nathan stepped out. No designer suit, no tie. Just a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up slightly, revealing a man no longer hiding behind a title. He walked slowly to the podium. He gripped the microphone like someone clinging to a last lifeline in a flood. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice low but steady, unscripted, free of pre-crafted words. "Many of you are probably waiting for me to explain, but today I'm not here to justify anything." He lifted his eyes to the room, where hundreds of pairs of eyes watched him, but he was searching for one familiar gaze. And then, in the back row, he saw her. Emily. She didn't stand. She didn't cover her face. She just sat there quietly, hair tied up high in a black blazer, her eyes not angry, but calm, like a lake after a storm. Nathan tightened his grip on the microphone. "I used to think that being a leader meant never showing weakness, never admitting fault, never bowing my head. But then one day someone walked away, without a word. And it was that silence that made me see myself most clearly." He took a deep breath. Each sentence seemed to pull apart years of rigidity, now cracking from within. "I looked down on a person just because I thought a title determined worth. I didn't realize that some gazes, once turned away, can never be won back." He paused. Then, as if guided by something unseen, Nathan stepped away from the podium. He walked straight down toward the audience. The sound of camera shutters erupted, but he didn't care. He stopped a few steps from Emily. "Emily Carter." He said her name for the first time, fully, clearly. "I was wrong, not just because I didn't trust you, but because I forgot that respecting a person is never something they need to prove. It's something that should be given from the start." The room fell into absolute silence. Then he bowed his head, Not a polite nod, not because anyone forced him, but a true bow from a man who once thought himself untouchable, now acknowledging he had hit his own rock bottom. He stood there, head lowered for so long no one dared break the stillness. Some slowly stood, others bowed their heads too, not out of forgiveness, but because they realized today was a rare moment when pride had let go. Emily stood up, her eyes never left him. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, but in that gaze something had shifted. No longer resentment, no longer accusation, just the look of someone who understood the value of silence and also knew when to give another person a chance to rise again. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She gave a slight, firm nod, then turned away. As she passed him, their shoulders nearly brushed, and in that moment, Nathan heard her voice, soft as a breath, but sharp enough to pierce the walls he'd built around himself his whole life. Next time, learn to listen, not to respond, but to understand. Then she walked away. She didn't look back, and Nathan stood there. He didn't say more, he didn't follow. He just let out a long breath, as if, for the first time in years, he truly understood that bowing his head wasn't a loss, but a way to begin again. A week after the press conference, no sensational headlines dominated the front pages anymore. The fiery articles had sunk to the bottom of the news feed. The financial world had moved on to the next scandal. The media had swept away the aftermath. But some things the media couldn't erase. Friday, the 25th floor of Hawthorne Co., an office reserved for strategic shareholder representatives, now Emily Carter's workspace, glowed with the soft golden light of late afternoon. Reports were neatly filed, the desk lamp cast a warm glow from the bookshelf, and the scent of peppermint lingered from a still warm teacup. She had just closed her laptop when there was a knock. Light, polite, unhurried. The door opened. Nathan Hawthorne stepped in. No longer the image of a man straining under the weight of power. Today he wore a pale blue shirt, holding a paper bag in his hand. He placed it on the table in front of her, his voice low but natural. "Peppermint tea and flaxseed oatmeal cookies. You once said, it's the combo for a bad day." Emily looked up. Her eyes weren't cold, nor were they soft. They were like a reflective surface, clear enough to hide nothing, yet deep enough that no one could easily reach their depths. She didn't touch the bag. She didn't ask why he was there. Nathan took a breath, not to defend himself this time, but to be honest. "I'm not here to ask for anything, just, if possible, I'd like to start over from the beginning." The air seemed to pause. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she tilted her head slightly, her gaze carrying a faint, wind-like tease. "So? What position are you applying for?" The question didn't need an answer, nor was it a challenge. Nathan gave a small smile, not to win her over, but as if he himself was surprised to find the courage to accept a new game, one that didn't start with status, but with listening. She stood, picked up her teacup and walked toward the door. She didn't gesture for him to leave, nor did she ask him to stay. As she passed him, very close, without touching, she paused and left a single sentence, neither a rejection nor forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is when someone chooses not to let hurt lead the way anymore. Then she stepped out. The sound of her heels clicked lightly on the wooden floor, steady, like a heartbeat after a storm. Nathan didn't follow. He stayed behind. In the room she'd just left, the scent of peppermint began to fill the air, gentle, light, and clearer than any words spoken. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, he didn't try to control it. He just sat there, learning to be silent, not to respond, but to understand. Outside, the city lit up. Windows glowed one by one like tiny sparks of hope, enough to guide the way if you looked close. Emily stood on the 25th floor balcony, the wind tugging at her hair. Below her was a world that had once turned its back on her, called her the nameless secretary, and silenced her with a hasty decision. But today, she was the one with the power to walk away, and also the one who chose not to use that power to crush anyone. Behind the door, the man who once didn't know how to say her name properly sat there, no longer apologizing, no longer pleading, just quiet. Perhaps every true beginning requires a humble ending. And perhaps sometimes the most beautiful conclusion isn't when someone says, "We'll start over," but simply, "This time, we'll listen to each other more."